the height of his fame, Val Kilmer was known for his voice. Not just the sound of it, but the way it carried authority, irony, seduction, and menace all at once. A voice that could slip effortlessly between a rock god, a gunslinger, a caped vigilante, and something harder to name. In the late 80s and early 90s, it felt like one of Hollywood's safest bets. A leading man who looked apart, spoke the language of charisma fluently, and seemed built for permanence. And yet, years later, the most haunting image associated with Val Kilmer would be silence. Not the dramatic kind, not the kind that follows scandal or disgrace, but a quieter, more unsettling absence. A man whose career was once defined by presence, now communicating through technology, gestures, and pauses. A transformation so complete that it forces an uncomfortable question. How does someone who appeared to have everything slowly slip out of the story without ever truly falling? This isn't a story about sudden collapse. There was no single night where the lights went out. No definitive moment where the industry turned its back. What happened to Val Kilmer unfolded over decades, through small fractures, creative friction, personal conviction, and a body that eventually refused to cooperate. Along the way, he gained a reputation that was easy to mock and difficult to understand. Brilliant, difficult, intense, uncompromising, labels that stuck even as the context faded. The contradiction is this: Val Kilmer did not lose his career because he lacked talent, opportunity, or ambition. He lost something far more elusive: control over how his story was told. And by the time the world realized what had been taken from him, it was already too late to restore it. If you're drawn to stories like this, the ones that live in the quiet spaces between success and disappearance, consider subscribing to the Final Cut Stories. This channel is dedicated to cinematic retrospectives that look beyond headlines and into the psychology and hidden currents that shape creative lives over time. Because Val Kilmer's story is not about one role or even one illness. It's about how a man who resisted simplification became, ironically, simplified by history, and how Hollywood, once convinced it knew exactly who he was, struggled to understand him when he stopped fitting the frame. Long before Val Kilmer became a symbol of Hollywood excess or artistic stubbornness, he was shaped by a far quieter kind of intensity. He grew up in a world where intellect and discipline were not optional, and where emotional self-reliance was learned early. His childhood carried privilege on the surface, but underneath it ran a current of loss and isolation that would later define how he moved through fame. Kilmer was drawn to performance not as a shortcut to attention, but as a controlled environment where meaning could be constructed. Acting, for him, was never about charm alone. It was about immersion, transformation, and truth, even when that truth was uncomfortable or inconvenient. This mindset separated him early from peers who treated acting as a ladder. He approached it as a calling, bordering on a belief system. His acceptance into Juilliard at a remarkably young age reinforced this seriousness. There, he was trained to think of acting as literature made physical, as psychology rendered through voice and movement. The emphasis was not on being liked, but on being precise. That distinction mattered. It trained him to prioritize internal logic over external approval, a habit that would later clash violently with Hollywood's more transactional culture. There was also an emotional guardedness forming during these years. Personal loss, including tragedy within his family, left him deeply private and inward-looking. Rather than softening him, it sharpened his sense of control. He learned to rely on craft instead of vulnerability, on preparation instead of vulnerability, on preparation instead of spontaneity. This made him formidable on stage and screen, but difficult in spaces that valued ease over depth. By the time Kilmer entered the professional world, he already carried a contradiction inside him. He possessed the looks and magnetism of a classic movie star, but the temperament of a theater purist. He wanted success, but only on his own terms. He wanted recognition, but not simplification. And perhaps without fully realizing it, he was preparing himself for a career defined not by smooth ascent, but by friction. This psychological foundation mattered more than any early credit. It shaped how he would respond to praise, how he would resist compromise, and how he would eventually collide with an industry that rewards consistency over conviction. Long before the spotlight found him, the fault lines were already there, waiting. When Val Kilmer finally broke through, Hollywood thought it understood exactly what it was getting. He arrived on screen with the confidence of someone who didn't need to ask for permission. The early roles were loud, charismatic, and deceptively light, but they carried an edge that audiences couldn't quite name. There was humor, but also detachment. Swagger, but never warmth. Even at his most entertaining, Kilmer seemed to be observing the moment rather than surrendering to it. The industry read this as cool. Films like Top Gun didn't just introduce him to a mass audience, they positioned him as a type. The rival. The challenger. The man who could stand next to a star and tilt the frame without overtaking it. Hollywood saw versatility, but also reliability. He was handsome without being soft, intelligent without being inaccessible. A leading man who could also sharpen someone else's performance simply by sharing the screen. As his profile rose, so did expectations. He was offered roles that leaned into surface qualities, confidence, masculinity, presence. Even when he took on more eccentric or demanding characters, the marketing flattened them into something safer. Jim Morrison became a biopic icon rather than a psychological excavation. The work was intense, obsessive, transformative, but the takeaway was image, not process. Behind the scenes, a quiet misalignment was forming. Kilmer treated each role as a self-contained universe, something to be inhabited fully, sometimes uncomfortably. Directors and studios, however, were looking for efficiency, consistency, predictability, the same face delivering a slightly different version of itself on schedule. The audience saw a star in ascent. Hollywood saw an asset gaining value. But Kilmer saw something else entirely. He believed he was building a body of work, not a brand. And the gap between those interpretations widened with every successful film. By the early 90s, Val Kilmer was no longer an emerging talent. He was a promise, one that Hollywood was eager to cash in, even if it meant ignoring the terms under which that promise had been made. Success is supposed to create freedom. For Val Kilmer, it did the opposite. As his films grew bigger, the margin for deviation grew smaller. The industry began to narrow its vision of who he was allowed to be. Each success quietly reinforced a template, and each deviation from that template was treated not as exploration, but as resistance. Kilmer was no longer just choosing roles. He was negotiating an identity that others believed they already owned. This pressure showed itself most clearly in how he worked. Kilmer's commitment to immersion, once praised as dedication, began to be reframed as difficulty. His insistence on psychological consistency, on honoring the internal logic of a character even when it slowed production, clashed with a system built on momentum and compromise. What had once been seen as seriousness now felt, to some, like defiance. The label followed him from set to set. Difficult, uncooperative, intense, words that say less about behavior than about compatibility. Hollywood tolerates obsession when it flatters power. It grows impatient when obsession challenges it. Kilmer's performances were increasingly strong, but the context around them grew colder. Then came Batman Forever, a role that should have solidified him as a permanent fixture at the top of the industry. Instead, it became a narrowing point. The suit erased nuance. The franchise demanded uniformity. Kilmer stepped into one of the most recognizable roles in cinema history, only to find that there was very little room inside it. Creative disagreements followed, and when he chose not to return, the decision was quietly interpreted as a liability rather than a boundary. Opportunities didn't vanish overnight. They became conditional. The unspoken message was clear: adapt or become expendable. And for someone whose entire artistic identity had been built on control, that message carried weight. This was not a public fall. It was an internal constriction, a slow realization that the space to work honestly was shrinking, even as the spotlight grew brighter. Kilmer had become famous for being himself, and now that self no longer fit comfortably within the machine that had elevated him. The turning point in Val Kilmer's career did not arrive with a scandal or a single catastrophic choice. It came through accumulation, By the mid to late 90s, the pattern was difficult to ignore. Each project carried more tension than the last. Stories from sets began to circulate, often stripped of nuance and repeated without context. What was once described as artistic conviction hardened into reputation. And reputation in Hollywood travels faster than truth. Kilmer found himself at odds not just with studios but with the logic of the system itself. Films like The Island of Dr. Moreau became symbols, not because they defined his talent, but because they confirmed an existing narrative. Chaotic productions, clashing visions, compromised leadership. Kilmer was only one element in a much larger dysfunction, yet he emerged as its most convenient shorthand. This was the moment when perception overtook performance. After that, roles began to shift. The scripts were less ambitious, the budgets smaller, the confidence from decision-makers noticeably thinner. Kilmer still delivered layered work, but it no longer reset the conversation. The industry had quietly moved on to safer investments, to actors who asked fewer questions and created fewer complications. What makes this turning point significant is not that Kilmer fought back, but that he didn't. He didn't publicly rebrand himself. He didn't soften his edges to regain favor. In many ways, he seemed to accept the consequences of not bending, even if he didn't fully agree with the verdict. From the outside, it looked like a decline. From the inside, it was a separation. A line drawn between the kind of work he was willing to do and the kind of career Hollywood was willing to offer. Nothing ended abruptly. But something essential changed. The momentum was gone. And once momentum disappears in this industry, it rarely returns. After the turning point, Val Kilmer did not disappear. He receded. The projects kept coming, but they arrived with different expectations and less attention. Independent films, supporting roles, voice work, and appearances that felt disconnected from the arc Hollywood once imagined for him. To the casual observer, it looked like a quiet fading. To those paying closer attention, it was a gradual reorientation. Kilmer's priorities began to shift in ways that were not immediately visible. He spent more time outside the studio system, exploring theater, writing, visual art, and deeply personal creative projects that didn't rely on mass approval. The pressure to maintain a certain image loosened, but so did the protections that came with mainstream relevance. Without the industry's momentum behind him, every choice carried more personal risk. Then came the physical changes. Health issues emerged slowly, at first kept private, then impossible to ignore. Throat cancer, its treatment, and the lasting damage to his voice altered not just how he worked, but how he existed publicly. For an actor whose instrument had always been central to his identity, this loss was profound. Communication became effortful. Presence became fragile. The silence that followed was not voluntary, but it was met with restraint. Kilmer did not rush to explain himself or reclaim sympathy. He adapted quietly, using technology, text, and collaboration to remain expressive. The world noticed the absence more than the persistence. Visibility decreased, but intention did not. He continued to engage with creativity on his own terms, even as the industry largely looked elsewhere. This phase of his life lacked the drama audiences often expect from decline. There were no explosive interviews, no bitter reckonings. Just distance, acceptance, and the slow passage of time. What remained was a figure no longer chasing relevance, but not surrendering to erasure either. A man adjusting to limits he did not choose while refusing to reduce himself to them. When the noise finally faded, Val Kilmer was left with something Hollywood had never really valued in him to begin with: stillness. Without the constant negotiation for roles, approval, or relevance, success began to mean something quieter and more internal. Kilmer turned inward, not out of retreat, but out of recalibration. Creativity no longer needed an audience of millions to justify itself. It only needed honesty. He began to speak, when he could, about art as survival rather than ambition, about faith, discipline, and the long view of a life that had already contained more extremes than most careers ever do. His work shifted toward personal expression, one-man stage performances, poetry, painting, and reflections that blurred the line between memory and meaning. These were not projects designed to restore a legacy. They were attempts to understand it. The loss of his voice forced a reckoning that fame had postponed. Without the ability to perform in the conventional sense, Kilmer had to confront who he was without the tools that once defined him. What emerged was not bitterness, but clarity. He no longer needed to prove intensity. He had lived it. He no longer needed to compete with his past. It had already passed. In later appearances, when he returned briefly to the screen, the effect was striking not because of nostalgia, but because of restraint. There was no attempt to reclaim dominance, only presence. A quiet acknowledgement of time, limitation, and continuity. The industry that once struggled with his resistance now framed him as a symbol of endurance, though that framing arrived long after it could change anything. Redefinition, for Kilmer, was not about reinvention. It was about subtraction, letting go of the need to be understood by systems that were never built to understand him. What remained was a sense of authorship over his own narrative, even if fewer people were listening. In that space, success became something private, measured not by visibility, but by alignment, not by applause, but by integrity. Val Kilmer's story resists the usual Hollywood conclusions because it was never really about rise or fall. It was about friction between talent and system, between depth and efficiency, between a man who believed art should demand something and an industry built to minimize demands. Time eventually softened the edges of his reputation, but it also clarified what had been there all along. Kilmer was not difficult in the way history often suggests. He was exacting in a culture that rewards flexibility. He was introspective in a business that prefers surfaces. And when his body imposed limits he never chose, he responded not with spectacle, but with quiet adaptation. His legacy does not live in a single role or even in the sum of them. It lives in the tension he never fully resolved. The reminder that not every gifted artist is meant to fit comfortably inside the machinery that promotes them. That some careers burn unevenly, not because of failure, but because of refusal. Hollywood tends to remember what is convenient. It celebrates longevity when it comes easily and mystifies disappearance when it does not. Val Kilmer complicates that narrative. He forces us to consider how much creative loss happens not in dramatic collapse, but in slow misalignment. How many voices are not silenced, but simply no longer heard in the same way? And perhaps that is the quiet truth at the center of this story. That fame is not what gives meaning to a creative life, and losing it does not erase meaning either. It only changes the scale at which that meaning exists. If this story stirred something in you, a thought about art, time, or the cost of staying true to oneself, feel free to share it. These stories don't end when the screen goes dark. They linger in the questions they leave behind.